We live in a society that romanticizes unrestricted emotional availability. From an early age, we learn that good people are always accessible, that to love is to never say no, and that refusing a request, even if it harms us, is a sign of selfishness. But what happens when someone starts to set boundaries? When they stop participating in family dramas? When they refuse to carry the feelings of others? When they protect their energy instead of offering it indiscriminately? The label appears almost instantly: cold, insensitive, selfish. But is that true? Or are we merely witnessing an act of mental health being interpreted as a moral deviation? Carl Gustav Jung, one of the most influential thinkers in depth psychology, saw this phenomenon clearly. For Jung, the journey of maturation, the process he called individuation, requires the individual to differentiate from the collective. This means, in simple terms, learning to maintain emotional integrity even within intimate relationships. But this movement, as healthy as it may be, threatens a social system based on emotional dependence, emotional fusion, and unspoken expectations. When someone begins to establish clear boundaries, they are, unwittingly, breaking an invisible contract, the tacit agreement to always be available to meet others' needs. It's not that the person has become cold. What has changed is their tolerance for imbalance. What was once seen as kindness may have actually been a fear of rejection. That goodness admired by all could hide a compulsion to please. The unquestionable loyalty that many exalted may have been masking a deep difficulty in saying no. And when these patterns are broken, those who previously benefited from this compulsive giving are forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. They were not dealing with a whole person, but with a version shaped to serve their needs. That is why the reaction is so intense. The individual who sets boundaries becomes a threat, not for being aggressive, but for being clear, not for rejecting others, but for choosing themselves. And this, for many, is unforgivable, because it holds up a mirror to them, a mirror that reveals their emotional immaturity, their difficulty in dealing with frustration, and their disguised dependence on affection. In this video, we will deeply explore this dynamic. We will understand, from Jungian psychology, why healthy boundaries are confused with coldness, why so many people resist the emotional autonomy of others, and how the process of individuation, despite being lonely and often misunderstood, is one of the noblest acts of self-respect and relational clarity. Jung teaches us that maturing is, inevitably, losing the acceptance of some. But it is in that very movement that we gain inner freedom. Modern society, despite all its advancements, still carries a deeply rooted legacy of emotional conditioning, an invisible system that teaches, reinforces, and even rewards self-denial in the name of social acceptance. From childhood, many are trained to believe that their self-esteem must come from external approval, that their goodness is measured by their ability to endure more than they should, and that true love is synonymous with constant sacrifice. In this distorted logic, setting boundaries becomes an act of rebellion, and more than that, a moral crime. This collective expectation creates a sophisticated emotional trap, the ideal of always being available. Being accessible at any time, for any demand, whether emotional, affectionate, or even practical, has become a standard not only expected, but required of those who wish to maintain connections. And here lies the cruel paradox. The more a person gives of themselves, the more they are valued. But the moment they decide to preserve their energy, their mental health, or even their time, they immediately become suspect, cold, different, selfish. Carl Jung saw this phenomenon as a clear reflection of emotional fusion, a state where individuals can no longer differentiate their own feelings from the feelings of others. When one person is emotionally fused with another, any attempt at separation is experienced as abandonment. In this type of dynamic, The other is not seen as an autonomous being, but as an emotional extension. And that is precisely why establishing a boundary is so threatening. It unmasks the symbiosis disguised as affection. It is important to understand that this conditioning is not just interpersonal, it is cultural. Movies, music, literature, and even religious speeches glorify unconditional love and total surrender. The figure of the good friend is one who is always there, even when it destroys them inside. The ideal mother is one who never says no, even if she is on the brink of collapse. The perfect partner is one who tolerates everything, forgives everything, accepts everything. Within this imaginary, the concept of a boundary becomes a direct threat to the idea of love. But what Jung proposes is something radically different. He asserts that true love, mature love, does not arise from fusion, but from differentiation, from the ability to be with the other without losing oneself. And this is only possible when the individual breaks away from collective conditioning and begins to ask themselves, am I being good, or am I just being convenient? Am I taking care of the other, or am I nullifying myself to be accepted? These questions inevitably lead to a transformation, because by starting to say no, the individual discovers something disturbing. Many of the connections they believed to be based on love were, in fact, based on utility. They were maintained not by mutual respect, but by emotional dependence. And that changes everything. It is at this point that reactions intensify. When you start to refuse to participate in family dramas, no longer respond immediately to messages from those who drain your energy, or simply choose to prioritize your own well-being, the people around you not only become annoyed, they feel betrayed. But what is really being betrayed here? A silent pact of self-denial. And it is precisely at this moment that something profound happens. You begin to see clearly who benefited from your lack of boundaries. And that is exactly what we will talk about in the next part. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. When you start to set boundaries, the first shock doesn't come from you. It comes from the reactions around you. And surprisingly, these reactions reveal more about others than about you. It is at this moment that masks fall. Those who once praised your kindness now say you have changed. Those who valued your generosity begin to accuse you of selfishness. But what is really happening here? The answer is harsh but necessary. Many people benefited, consciously or unconsciously, from your lack of boundaries. Carl Jung observed that, throughout the process of individuation, the individual needs to break away from the role assigned to them by the collective unconscious. And one of the roles most reinforced by society is that of the helpful person, that figure who is always there to listen, help, support, and, deep down, be an emotional container for others. However, this role, although seemingly virtuous, is often not a product of choice. It is an internalized compulsion, a strategy for psychic survival. And this compulsion, for Jung, represents a prison. When you start to step out of this role, you force others to take on responsibilities that were previously outsourced to you. The friend who always called you to vent now needs to look at their own loneliness. The family member who expected you to solve their problems begins to confront their own incapacity. The partner who relied on your tolerance to avoid change must finally mature, and this is uncomfortable. Because what was being projected onto you, the caregiver role, the problem solver, the free therapist, dissolves. And what remains is the naked truth. There was a dynamic of dependency, not reciprocity. Jung would say that at this moment you are withdrawing your shadow from the field of the other. In other words, you are stopping carrying what was never yours. You are interrupting the cycle of unconscious projections that placed you as responsible for others' feelings, decisions, and frustrations. And this can be devastating for those who have not yet developed their own emotional autonomy. That is why the accusation of coldness arises so strongly. It is a defense mechanism, a way to maintain the illusion that the problem lies not in the relationship, but in you. Because if you are cold, then the other does not need to take responsibility for anything. But if you are simply healthy, lucid, and aware, then they will have to face their own immaturity, their own selfishness, their own escape from themselves. It is at this exact point that many relationships begin to dissolve, not because you did something wrong, but because you stopped sustaining an illusion. And in this often painful rupture, you begin to glimpse the difference between relationships based on exchange and relationships based on control disguised as affection. But here arises a fundamental and deeply misunderstood question: how to distinguish between a truly cold person and a person who is just learning to preserve themselves? How to know if you are being mature or simply shutting down out of fear? The answer requires a deep understanding of the difference between coldness and emotional maturity. And that is what we will explore in the next part. There is a thin, but absolutely essential line between genuine coldness and emotional maturity. And when this line is misunderstood, it becomes the basis for misguided judgments, unfair accusations, and unnecessary breakups. After all, what truly differentiates an emotionally mature person from an emotionally indifferent one? The answer lies not in external appearance, but in the internal intention behind choices. A cold person, in the psychological sense, does not seek connection. They avoid intimacy, shut themselves off from affection, and reject vulnerability. Their distance is not an act of self-care, but a rigid defense mechanism, often a result of unprocessed traumas, accumulated hurts, and a deep belief that opening up is the same as getting hurt. Coldness is the freezing of affection. It is the radical closing of the soul to the risk of being touched. It does not impose boundaries because it respects itself. It builds walls because it fears being seen. Emotional maturity, on the other hand, is completely different. A mature person does not reject connection. They consciously select it. They do not avoid bonds. They establish connections based on mutual respect and emotional responsibility. They do not flee from intimacy. They simply do not offer it to anyone, nor at any cost. Their boundaries are not walls, they are doors with locks. And only those who have the key of care, reciprocity, and true listening can enter. Carl Jung understood this distinction as a central part of the individuation process. For him, developing what he called differentiation was learning to be with another without losing oneself. In other words, abandoning the childish ideal of absolute fusion with the other, where it is expected that love means carrying the problems, traumas, and pains of others, and moving towards relationships where each person is responsible for their own psyche. This, far from being coldness, is what Jung referred to as the maturity of the soul. The emotionally mature individual does not live reacting to the chaos of others. They observe, understand, support, but do not sink along with them. They know how to offer presence, but do not nullify themselves. They know how to listen, but do not become an emotional trash can. They firmly sustain their own energy precisely to be able to offer it consciously, and not impulsively or compulsively. This kind of emotional clarity is unsettling because it exposes the effective lack of those who still live based on need and fusion. Therefore, the mature person is often labeled as cold, not because they reject others, but because they refuse to dive into the unconscious drama of others. And this refusal, for those trapped in the idea that love is sacrifice, sounds like abandonment. But it is not. Saying no to a draining relationship is not coldness. It is lucidity. Imposing limits in the face of abusive emotional demands is not selfishness. It is effective responsibility. Emotional maturity does not nullify affection, it qualifies it. And when this clarity settles in, it begins to function as a powerful filter. Fragile relationships, based on projection, control, or need, tend to disintegrate in the presence of someone who knows how to stand firm. True bonds, based on respect and mutual growth, flourish. And this is exactly what begins to happen when you stop behaving like an emotional character and start presenting yourself as a real presence. But this transformation, as powerful as it is, does not happen without consequences. Because by establishing clear boundaries, you inevitably activate a profound side effect. You force others to confront their own emotional immaturity, and many are not ready for that. It is about this transformative and sometimes devastating impact that we will talk about in the next part. Establishing boundaries is not just an act of personal protection. It is a transformative force that acts as a catalyst in relationships. And like any catalyst, it accelerates processes that were already quietly underway. When you start saying no, withdrawing from emotional manipulation dynamics, or simply stop meeting others' expectations at the expense of yourself, something inevitable happens. The relationships that were sustained by imbalance begin to collapse. Carl Jung understood this collapse as a natural consequence of differentiation. By ceasing to be a psychic extension of the other, you stop validating the unconscious fantasies projected onto you. Those who saw you as a savior, nice one, tireless, or eternally available now have to deal with their own lack, their own anger, their own fragility. And often, this is too much for someone who has never had to look inward. Emotionally immature relationships do not survive clear boundaries because they were built on unspoken expectations, unconscious roles, and unequal exchanges. One always yields, the other always demands. One listens, the other vents. One gives, the other consumes. When this cycle is interrupted by a boundary, the dynamic breaks, and the bond often crumbles along with it. But here is the hardest point to accept. This collapse is necessary. It is not about loss, but about revelation. What falls was not solid. What ends was not mutual. Jung believed that true psychic growth requires a process of symbolic death and rebirth. And often, this rebirth begins with the end of relationships that were preventing you from fully existing. It is at this very moment that many people enter into internal conflict, because no matter how toxic a relationship may have been, it still offered something familiar: belonging, routine, a false sense of acceptance. By breaking this pattern, fear arises. What if I end up alone? What if no one else accepts me like this? What if I am being too harsh? But these questions are part of the process. They are signs that you are moving out of the emotional fusion zone into a new stage of consciousness, that of emotional autonomy. It is important to understand that not all relationships that collapse with healthy boundaries were, in fact, authentic bonds. Many were unconscious alliances based on victim and savior roles, dependency and convenience, control and submission. Jung would say that by interrupting these cycles, you are freeing yourself, and paradoxically, you are also giving the other a chance to grow. But this only happens if the other is willing to mature. Otherwise, they will leave, and let them go. The pain of loss, in these cases, does not come from the absence of the other, but from the breaking of an identity that was sustained by their approval. What hurts is realizing that you were loved not for who you are, but for what you offered. And this realization can be devastating, but also liberating. This moment marks a point of no return in the journey of individuation. Because now you understand that true relationships not only withstand boundaries, they thrive with them. They are nourished by clarity, not by guilt. They grow with no just as much as with yes. And it is precisely this vision that paves the way for an even deeper transformation. From here, the question shifts from how to maintain old relationships to Who am I becoming when I start to live aligned with my emotional integrity? Jung had a clear answer to this. You are entering the process of individuation. And it is about this process, deep, solitary, and essential, that we will talk about in the next part. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. For Carl Gustav Jung, individuation was not just a theoretical concept, it was the backbone of psychological maturation. Jung believed that human beings are born incomplete, fragmented, operating under the influence of the collective unconscious, social expectations, and family projections. Becoming an individual, in the fullest sense of the word, is precisely about breaking free from these invisible ties to become who one truly is, even if that means displeasing, disappointing, or distancing oneself from others. The process of individuation is, above all, a movement of return to oneself. But this return does not happen lightly or painlessly. It requires confronting the masks we wear to be accepted. It demands questioning roles that were imposed on us even before we knew who we were. And perhaps the most difficult part, it requires us to take responsibility for ourselves, including for what we have always blamed on others. When you start to set boundaries, you are consciously or unconsciously initiating this process, because saying no to what invades you is saying yes to what constitutes you. It is the beginning of a life where your energy is no longer at the service of external approval, but of your internal integrity. For Jung, this is the moment when the ego, the conscious part of the personality, begins to dialogue with the self, the deepest and most totalizing instance of being. This dialogue does not happen amid the noise of the crowd. It only establishes itself when the individual has the courage to separate from the collective. And this separation is not physical. It is psychic. It is the moment when you stop acting automatically based on others and start acting from your own awareness. It is when you cease to ask yourself, what do they expect from me? And begin to ask, what is true for me? It is a symbolic rupture with the pact of invisibility that so many make to survive emotionally in environments where authenticity is unwelcome. Individuation, therefore, is not isolation, it is differentiation. And that changes everything. Because now you are no longer available to be the character that others project. You are no longer the automatic peacemaker of the family, the friend who never complains, the partner who swallows everything in the name of peace. You become a being who chooses with whom to engage, how to engage, and to what extent you are willing to go. This is psychological freedom. And paradoxically, it is this freedom that enables you to live more authentic relationships. Jung asserted that the self is not an ideal of perfection, but an organizing center that emerges when we become whole. That is, when we embrace both our light and our shadow. And it is precisely in the ability to set boundaries that this wholeness begins to manifest. Because a boundary is not just a barrier, it is an affirmation. I know myself, I respect myself, and I expect the same from those who wish to connect with me. That is why people who go through this process, despite dealing with initial losses and discomforts, report a kind of existential relief. Because they stop acting for the first time and begin to live. They cease to negotiate their essence in exchange for acceptance. And in this new psychic territory, parasitic relationships no longer have space, but authentic bonds can finally be born. However, this transition is not easy. Many arrive here exhausted, confused, even feeling guilty. And it is here that a fundamental dilemma arises. How to communicate these boundaries without falling into defensiveness? How to express this new internal posture without further fueling external conflict? Is there a way to protect your energy while also preserving the dignity of relationships? The answer lies in how you communicate your new place in the world. And that is what we will discuss in the next part, how boundaries become statements of respect, both for yourself and for the other. Saying no is one of the most sophisticated ways to say yes. Yes to your mental health. Yes to your inner peace. Yes to your truth. But in a world where relationships are often guided by guilt, emotional manipulation, and veiled dependency, setting a boundary is frequently interpreted as rejection. The truth, however, is that boundaries are not walls. They are solid bridges to authentic relationships. They do not serve to push away, but to clarify. They do not destroy bonds. They only reveal which bonds can survive in the light of truth. When you say, "I can no longer be available all the time," you are not saying that the other person does not matter. You are saying, "I matter too." When you refuse to carry the pain that is not yours, you are not being indifferent. You are recognizing that empathy without limits turns into self-destruction disguised as compassion. And when you step away from toxic emotional dynamics, you are not being cold, you are being fair to yourself and to the other. Carl Jung believed that true respect arises from clarity. He wrote that only that which is differentiated can unite in a meaningful way. In other words, there is only real intimacy when there are two whole individuals aware of their own contours, dialoguing from truth, and not from unconscious fusion. When you set boundaries, you are saying, "I know myself well enough to know how far I can go without losing myself." And you are also saying, "I respect you enough not to become what you need at the expense of my essence." This kind of positioning is not coldness. It is courage. It is the courage to abandon the old version of yourself that molded to fit others' expectations. It is the courage to be alone if necessary, rather than remain in bonds that drain, nullify, or corrupt. It is the courage to build relationships based on awareness, not on lack. And yes, there will be losses. There will be silences, distancing, criticism, but there will also be peace. There will be space. And, more importantly, there will be you, whole, present. No longer just playing roles, but living your own truth. This is individuation. This is emotional maturity. This is freedom. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been called cold for simply starting to respect yourself? Have you ever experienced the pain of losing relationships that only existed while you were nullifying yourself? Share your experience in the comments. Your story can help others who are on the same path. And if this video helped you see your own relationships more clearly, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Here, we don't offer empty advice. We dive deep into the human psyche. And now, keep watching the next video. It is essential for your transformation journey. You have already taken an important step. The next one is even deeper.